Hello and welcome to the Petticoated Swashbuckler. My name is Maren and today I'm going to give you a very hot Christmas present tips. Now, as many of you might know, I'm Norwegian. And if you look at a map of Norway, you can tell that Norway is like mostly coast. With a few mountains in between. Like there's a lot of coastline to Norway. And this is the reason why fishing has always been a very, very important industry in Norway. All the way back to like the Iron Age, we have evidence of people kind of engaging in trade with fish. And it's especially the kind of seasonal fishing that's been very, very important. And the most important of all the seasonal kind of fishing bouts is what we call the Lofoten fishing. Now, Lofoten is a group of islands and peninsulas in the north of Norway. If you think of Norway as like an arm, you got Oslo like here. And then it goes down and you have the coastline up here. Lofoten kind of juts out about here. And in the seas around Lofoten are vast areas where cod go to mate, to have their little cod babies, or eggs, they lay eggs. And that's a great opportunity for people to go and fish a lot of cod. And from about sort of after Christmas, January, all the way through to April, really, people used to go to Lofoten and fish immense amounts of cod. Ever since the Iron Age, at least, probably even before. I mean, as soon as they realised that, wow, the cod sure does like Lofoten in the winter. Now the cod fishing developed through what you call the Viking Age and the medieval period, and became a very, very, very important basis for economy, where you have people who live kind of 1 foot on land, 1 foot on sea, who go out after Christmas and fish cod. The cod was then taken in to any of the like little towns and villages in Lofoten, where it's processed, and then it was sold to Europe. And cod was really the way it was processed is it was dried, and drying cod is magic. I mean, it stinks. It really does. I used to live in northern Norway. Our neighbours used to dry cod. I like the taste, but it smells like rotten fish. But it's not rotten. It's safe to eat. It preserves basically all nutrients, and it makes it possible to store for years without refrigeration or even salt. You can just pop it in a barrel and store it. And what you have to remember is that in the medieval period, pretty much all of Europe, if we don't count like bits of Spain, the rest of Europe was Catholic, and fasting days and fasting periods was very, very important. So all throughout Europe, people would eat fish instead of meat on Fridays, sometimes Wednesdays, Saturdays, and the long fast before Easter, in the shorter fast before Christmas, on other special fast days. If the church decided that you'd done something wrong, and you could be told, you could be court ordered to fast, to eat only fish for a given time period. All of this meant that there was a very big market for fish, especially fish that you could buy in bulk and keep. There's a reason why the national dish of Portugal is bacalhau. Bacalhau is made with Norwegian cod, traditionally. Fished in Lofoten, processed, dried on the kind of the stony outcrops along the coasts. Why it's actually called stonefish, klippfisk, in Norwegian. It was a huge business, and the people who fished in Lofoten and who traded with people throughout Europe, they made a pretty penny. Then, of course, came the Black Death and kind of disrupted the whole deal. And by the time they had the kind of fishing and trade network back on its feet, the Hanseatic League had kind of swept in and taken over a lot of the middleman sort of thing. The Hanseatic League was a German trading league. They set up shop in many parts of Europe, especially in the Scandinavian countries. If you ever go to Bergen, on the western coast of Norway, beautiful city, I would absolutely recommend it. They have some very distinctive architecture along the kind of harbour. That's old Hanseatic houses from where the Hanseatic traders traded with the northern cod, the northern fish. And they were brilliant traders, but they weren't always so good for the local economy. They were very insular, so they would keep to themselves. They had very strict rules about not marrying local women, for example. And when they had served their kind of apprenticeship in Norway, they would go back to Germany and they would get a higher position somewhere where they wanted to live. Now this is only one thing that they did. Another thing that they did was they started the system of in Norwegian it's called Nordlandsgjeld. It's basically northern debt. It means that the fishermen, instead of trading with European middlemen themselves, found one Hanseatic trader that they always brought their fish to. And the Hanseatic trader would pay them in advance, and they always paid them a little too much, so that they felt like they'd been given a good deal. But what in reality happened was that they were in perpetual debt to that particular Hanseatic trader. Very clever and not very ethical, but they made a lot of money on it. The Lofoten fishing kind of went through ebbs and flows, no direct pun intended, for centuries. It did a dip in the 1600s when economy took a turn for the worse, and there were lots of plague outbreaks. Then it improved a little bit in the 1700s. Throughout the 19th century, an increased industrialization kind of affected not just the lives of the fishermen, but also how much they caught. And by the early 1900s, they had pretty much fished up everything there was. Huge depletion problem. Barely any cod left, to be honest. And so regulations were put in to protect the fish and make sure we didn't empty the seas of cod. And that's one of the reasons why the Lofoten fish it's still done. People still go to Lofoten to fish, and it's still a big thing in winter to go cod fishing in Lofoten. However, it's they catch a lot less now than they did in the 1800s, and that's a good thing because it means we can keep fishing cod outside of the Norwegian coast for centuries to come, hopefully. And of course, there were other problems as well. When the Reformation came, people in huge parts of Europe stopped eating fish regularly, like 2 or 3 days a week. That kind of affected trade a little bit. But it's still, Norwegian fish is still a big thing. It's still a big export for us. Now, how was the practicalities of this this Lofoten fishing? Well, my great-grandfather was a northern Norwegian farmer fisherman, and he used to go Lofoten fishing after Christmas. It was very normal where he and my great-grandmother and my grandmother lived, and all of her many siblings. They were not wealthy. They had a small house, many children, few animals, struggled to get by, took shifts at the local dairy factory to make ends meet. But one of the ways that they actually survived was by him taking off for months on end to go fishing in Lofoten every winter. For the most people, for the most of history, it was really hard work. I mean, it still is hard work. Being a fisherman is really hard work, but it was even worse throughout most of history. People would go in open boats, and of course you would row or sail to Lofoten from wherever you came from first. So you're already kind of tired and cold by the time you get there. The boats kind of look like tiny miniature Viking ships. They're very cute. We used to have one when I was a kid, and they are a lot of work, but they are really beautiful. They had sails and they had oars, so you could rely on both. But most of the time, people would just my impression from my great-grandfather is that they mostly just rowed. Like, they would row to Lofoten, and then they would kind of set up camp in what in Norwegian is called a rorbu. I have no idea what it's called in English, and I haven't been able to look it up. But it's basically a tiny little shed where you could keep your equipment and where you could sleep under some sort of roof. People worked in teams. The guy who was kind of the captain, often the guy who owned the boat, but not always, pocketed the most of the profits. Whereas the young guy who was there on his first trip, he would mostly be responsible for cooking for the other guys. They went out in the morning as soon as the sun rose, which, to be honest, in northern Norway in winter is not very early. Probably some of them went out before the sun rose because, especially first part of January, there really isn't any sun in Lofoten. It's dark. It's dusky all round the day. So they went out first kind of light of morning, and they fished. They used yarns, they used lines, hauling as much as they could until kind of nightfall, and then they would row or possibly sail back to their little sheds. They would get help from the locals processing the fish. The heads would be cut off. Those were dried and used for animal food. The fish were kind of gutted and sliced open and hung up to start the drying process. The tongues of the cods were sometimes cut out of their heads, and they're a delicacy. They're really good. If you have the possibility at some point in your life to try cod's tongues, trust me, do it. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, and it does sound faintly disgusting if you haven't tried it, but it's so tasty. And then kind of rinse, repeat. And it was really cold. If you haven't been to northern Norway in winter, I'm not sure I can explain to you just how bitterly cold it can get. It's cold, it's icy, it's stormy. I mean, there were regular drowning, people's boats capsizing and people drowning, and most fishermen couldn't swim. They didn't know how to swim. It wasn't taught them, and they didn't consider it something worth knowing. Because if God had decided that you were going to drown, you would drown. And learning to swim was just considered pride. You were imagining that you could set your, kind of change the fate that God had set for you. But it's stormy, it's windy, the cold just goes right through you. So to keep cold and boredom and starvation at bay, they took some precautions. And when I say they, I kind of, it's mostly really their wives. The men, of course, did their preparations. They prepared their nets and their boats and all of that, which is super important, because if your nets and your lines aren't working, you won't catch anything. And if your boat's not working, you'll get very wet very quickly. But the women were really in charge of like making sure they were fed and clothed for the trip. My grandmother told me that they used to bake. I'm not sure how to explain. They look like the kind of white, kind of thick Christmas cookie sort of things that you can still buy some places, but it was usually cooked with whale blubber, and they would put them in like metal buckets with lids on, and they would keep for weeks and be really tasty and like sweet and fat and just everything that your body needs when you spend all your days out on the ocean in the wind in Lofoten in February. And they would make sure they had woolen clothing, oil skins, everything to like keep the cold at bay. My grandmother told me that they used to knit mittens for the men, and whereas a normal mitten is like a body for the hand and then one for the thumb, they would have a thumb piece on either side, because they did so much rowing that the inside would get worn down. So when that's starting to wear down, you just swap them around. So the worn bit is up on the back of your hand and you have a new piece to wear through. And also to keep the mittens from wearing out too quickly, they would knit with horsehair in the yarn, which must have given them awful blisters in the hands, but which would have made them wear a lot slower. And according to my grandmother, some of them, if they were like knitting mittens for like boyfriends, sweethearts, they would knit their own hair into the mittens, which I think is kind of bizarre and also so romantic. And it kind of reminds me of the hair jewellery that you can find from the Victorian era, where you mourn a loved one by cutting some of the deceased person's hair off and like fashioning it into jewellery. It's kind of reminiscent of that way of using parts of the body of people you love to kind of, yeah. I like it. I think it's romantic. Now, another thing that you would knit and give to your sweetheart before he left for Lofoten is what I am currently knitting now. And this is where we get into the possibility of not safe for work area. Like it's not kind of straight up lewd, but it's suggestive. Now, women were worried that their boyfriends would freeze out there on the ocean. Especially they had some understanding of how testicles worked. My cat is not happy with me. He does not have testicles anymore, so this is a sore point for him. Mimi! Mimi! Do you want to come and join me? Despite your lack of testicles? Not so sure. Sorry, darling. Where were I? Oh yeah, testicles. They knew that if your testicles were subjected to severe frosts, that could affect your kind of ability to produce children in the future. And if you're a young Norwegian girl and you want a big family and your boyfriend's headed out for Lofoten, that's a genuine kind of worry. That's something you want to address. So what you could do to be romantic and showing that you care is that you can knit him what is called a hyssa. And it is this. It is basically a little sock for your whatever rhymes with sock. The pattern for this is taken from the genuine article. I will link it, but a couple of these have survived, even though I would imagine this is not something that you hand over to your local museum, you know. Oh, you're collecting stuff from the local fisherman. Here, have my sock. But still some have survived. The pattern is taken from one of them. There were two options on the website. I'll link the pattern and the website and everything. The pattern is in Norwegian, but I'll translate it it's open source. I'll translate it in the description. There were two size options. You don't want to be offensive, so I went with the bigger one. And I just figure, I mean, it's cold, it's going to be room in here, but you can always stuff some more in here, like maybe some woolen rags or a worn out sock or something to just insulate it further. And then it kind of is just tied around like so. Isn't it romantic? And this is genuinely something people made and gave to their boyfriends. And there's a pragmatism. It's romantic, but there's also a pragmatism to it that I love, and that I feel is very. It's very typical for that part of the country. I feel like in every European country, it's always like, oh, the people in the north are a little coarser and a little more direct than the people further south. You know, just think of Scotland versus England. But I think we have the same thing in Norway. They were the most common name for it that I found was hysa. They are that's basically, it basically means house. It means a little house or a little kind of thing you put something in. I also found hysa på tampen, which basically means the little house on the end of your rope, which I can see it. Or forhysa, which basically means the house in front. Anyway, this is my boyfriend is not going to Lofoten for Christmas. But he's going away for Christmas. We're spending Christmas apart. So I thought this would be a fun, a little reminder to him when he's rowing across the ocean. He's taking a plane, but airports can be chilly too.